Oh, Jesus Christ, no. They're not sharp. Oh, got to do it all again now. Well, that's something to avoid, isn't it? Is when you open up the computer and find all the photos you've just taken, they've got camera shake and they're completely unusable. And that's what this video is all about, is how to get consistently sharp photos whilst hand holding the camera. The first thing to cover is how you handle the camera. And it's not like this, when you've got the camera out, you've got both hands on the body and you want to take a shot and you're just looking through the back of the screen on the camera and you want to take a photo. So the best way to do it is to have at least 3 points of contact with the camera and yourself. And what you do is one hand cradles the lens, and then you have your elbows tucked into your stomach, and then the third point of contact is through the viewfinder on your body and a good stable stance. Legs not close together because your body can sway a little bit, so you want to have legs slightly wide apart, slightly bent, and then you can take your shot and you've got good stability there, and off you go. So the next thing we consider is the settings inside the camera. I did do a video a few months ago on techniques on how to get sharp photos, but I want to do a video specifically for getting sharp photos handheld, because there's a few more techniques I didn't cover in that video. And to be honest with you, most people are using their camera handheld and not got a tripod everywhere. I mean, it's going to be quite inconvenient to drag that out if you're at a wedding or a party or a sports event, or even some wildlife photography where you want to react quickly to different situations and capture those special moments that you might miss if you have to set up a tripod. And the first setting we'll talk about is the shutter speed. And the general rule is, for full frame cameras, you would set your shutter speed equal to the focal length you're using. Or if you've got a crop sensor camera, you would double the shutter speed to the focal length. So for example, if you're shooting at 50mm, then you would set your shutter speed on your full frame camera at 1/50th of a second. And for a crop sensor camera, you would set that to 1/100th of a second. But that's for stationary subjects. But if subjects are moving about, like late at night at a party and have had a couple of drinks, then you're going to want to set your camera minimum to 1/500th of a second or higher. Because the last thing you want to show them in the morning is a blurry photo, because they might think they're not recovered from the night before. So let me give you a visual representation of what I mean about the focal length and why you match your shutter speed to whatever focal length you're using. So I have a stick here, and this represents, say, 50mm. And so if I just wiggle that, you can see it moves a little bit. And then now I have a longer stick, and this is, say, 400mm focal length. And I wiggle this the same amount, but you can see how much it moves. And that is the reason why you set your shutter speed equal to the focal length you're using. Or you double it if you're using a crop sensor camera. So there is IS and IBIS, and what I mean by that is image stabilization built into the lens and in-body image stabilization built into the camera. And if you do have these features, I would definitely look to test these features out before you commit to using them on a photo shoot, as they do allow you to stop down lower than the standard recommended shutter speed that you would use if you didn't have these features. So definitely test them out to ensure that you're happy with the results that they give you. So as you are using the camera handheld, then you will be restricted with the shutter speed in line with the focal length you're using with your lens. That means you need to compensate that with your aperture and your ISO. And let's talk about the aperture. Well, it's built into the lens and it opens up really wide and then closes down really small. But it has another effect on the image, which is the depth of field. So a really small aperture creates a large depth of field, meaning everything's sharp in the image, but also it creates a bit of diffraction when you go really small. So that softens the image. But you'll be most interested in a wider aperture because you'll be compensating for the light coming through onto the sensor. So therefore that would then have a smaller depth of field. But that leads into other issues, you see. So if you're hand holding the camera and you're moving about slightly, which you can't stay perfectly still, and the subject you're choosing, a model for instance, and they're stationary, but they might sway a little bit as well. And if you're using a really small depth of field to get that beautiful bokeh that you want, then you could be just moving enough to come outside the depth of field, say on a one-shot mode in the camera on the autofocus, then that causes your image to be softer or not as sharp as you expect. So I definitely would recommend to consider the depth of field that you're using and also the autofocus modes that you'll be choosing. And that's what we'll lead on to now. So autofocus, I would use a single point autofocus to really narrow in on the subject of interest, maybe if it's a model or an animal, the eye. And also if you're using a narrow depth of field, choose continuous or servo mode, which means when you focus on your subject, then the focus will move with the subject that you're choosing, or if you move, it will still stay locked on and within the depth of field that you've chosen. But also with the focus modes as well, using continuous and servo, if you're taking pictures of a sport or children or animals that are moving you can't control that well, then definitely keep that mode on. But if they're dead stationary, then obviously choose the one-shot mode. But keep it single, keep the smallest focus point you can use within the camera. Because if you go to the evaluated areas, then you could find that the camera will choose a focus point, say an object that's close to your subject, but it's out of focus due to the depth of field, it might lock onto that instead. But you still think you nailed it because you're hearing that little noise the camera makes to say you're nailing your shot. So just be mindful of that. So now we get onto ISO and how that can affect your image. Well, the higher the ISO you go, the brighter the image becomes, but also it introduces grain. And basically it's built onto the sensor in effect, and you're making the sensor more sensitive to the light. But you need to test your camera out to make sure where the ISO setting is the highest point before your image becomes unusable, because it introduces this noise or grain. But most modern sensors can go quite high, and also you've got modern post-processing software that can clean up the image really well, especially Lightroom with their latest denoise feature they got. But I'd definitely use that. And there's another little tip that you can use that a lot of pros use. You can set your camera into manual where you've got full control of your aperture and your shutter speed, and then but just put your ISO into auto mode. Therefore, when you adjust your aperture and your shutter speed, then the camera will still give you the exposure that you need. But obviously there's limitations because the minimum shutter speed and you're setting your maximum ISO before it gets too unusable, and even the software can't clean it up. So just be mindful of that. But it's a really good trick that you can use. And if you are enjoying this video, that's fantastic. Put some comments in below. Also, hit that subscribe button, press the like button and the notification bell for more content like this. So let's just recap on what we discussed in the video. So the shutter speed needs to be a minimum of the focal length of the lens, double if you've got a crop sensor camera, and then therefore the aperture, depth of field, be mindful of the depth of field when you're using a wide aperture, and also consider the focus modes that you're using, so single point focus mode, and obviously if you've got a really small depth of field, consider using continuous or servo mode if you have a Canon. And that'll allow you, if you have a slight bit of movement, to pinpoint your focus and it will stay focused within the depth of field. The ISO, then obviously when you bump up the ISO, set a top limit before your image becomes unusable due to too much grain. And then in low light situations, consider using artificial light like flash, and then don't point it directly at the subject, but search YouTube for videos on how to use flash effectively and make it more natural as well. If you want to know more in depth about the Aperture, well then check this video out, and it's all about the Aperture and how you can use that and how it affects the depth of field. So be sure to subscribe, hit that like button and the notification bell for future uploads. Put some comments in below for me to read because I really look forward to seeing them, and I'll see you in the next one.